What happens when one narrow strip of water becomes a pressure point for the entire world? And what does a superpower do when that strip is shut, reopened, and then shut again by men who believe time is on their side? Before we go further, if you want calm analysis when the headlines get loud, tap like, subscribe, and share this with one friend who follows global politics. Because this story is not really about a stretch of water. It is about power. It is about fear. It is about whether the global economy still rests on stable rules, or whether it can be shaken by one regime willing to gamble with everyone else's pain. The Strait of Hormuz looks small on a map. In real life, it is one of the most important choke points on Earth. Huge volumes of oil pass through it every single day. A massive share of the world's liquefied natural gas moves through it too. If that route becomes dangerous, the shock does not stay in the Gulf. It races into fuel prices, shipping costs, airline budgets, factory planning, stock markets, and household bills. A local crisis becomes a global tax. That is why the world watches Hormuz with an odd mix of boredom and terror. Boredom because this threat has been around for years. Terror because everyone knows that one day the threat might stop being a warning and become an event. And when Iran's ruling clerics moved to reclose the strait, many people expected the usual script: angry speeches, nervous markets, diplomats urging restraint, a few military images for television, then maybe a slow return to normal. But that is not what made this episode so important. The real surprise came after the reclosure. America did not just complain, America changed the game. To understand why that matters, we need to slow down and ask a harder question. Why would Iran do this at all, knowing the risks? Why touch the live wire? Why threaten the one waterway that can turn half the world against you? At first glance, it looks irrational. Iran also depends on the same region. Iran knows a crisis can invite overwhelming force. Iran knows closing Hormuz is the kind of move that can make even neutral countries quietly side with Washington. So why do it? Because pressure can be a weapon even when victory is impossible. That is the first idea you need to keep in mind tonight. Iran does not need to defeat the United States in a direct war to create leverage. It only needs to convince everyone that the cost of containing Iran will be high, prolonged, and economically painful. If one side can impose enough uncertainty, it can shape the behavior of players far beyond the battlefield. In other words, this is not just military strategy, it is psychological strategy. Iran's leadership understands something many outside observers forget. Markets do not wait for certainty. Insurance companies do not wait for certainty. Shipping firms do not wait for certainty. Energy traders do not wait for certainty. The mere possibility of disruption can move prices, delay cargoes, freeze decisions, and spread fear. A threat can do damage before a single missile lands. That is why Hormuz has always been more than geography. It is a hostage note written on the map. Now let's go one level deeper. The men who run Iran's system do not think exactly like Western analysts often assume. They do not always ask, how do we avoid pain right now? Very often they ask, how do we survive long enough to make the other side tired? That is a different mindset. It is slower, harder, more ideological, and sometimes more dangerous. For leaders with that mindset, escalation is not always a last resort. Sometimes it is a signal, a way of saying, if you corner us, the fire will not stay in our house, and that helps explain the reclosure. According to reporting during the crisis, Iran's Revolutionary Guard declared the strait fully closed again after earlier signals of limited reopening, tying its stance to continuing American pressure at sea. That detail matters. It tells us this was not simply a random outburst. It was a bargaining move, a punishment move, and a propaganda move all at once. Bargaining, because Iran wanted to raise the price of pressure. Punishment, because it wanted to show that outside coercion would trigger wider consequences. And propaganda, because the regime always needs to prove to its own supporters that it still has teeth. Authoritarian systems live on theater almost as much as force. They need spectacle, they need defiance, they need moments that can be packaged as resistance. But theater becomes risky when the audience includes the US Navy. This is where the story becomes much more interesting. Many people assumed America's most obvious answer would be to focus only on escorting ships through the strait, like a replay of older convoy missions. That expectation had history behind it. During the late stages of the Iran-Iraq War, the United States ran Operation Earnest Will, escorting reflagged Kuwaiti tankers through dangerous waters. It was one of the biggest convoy operations since World War II. It kept traffic moving, but it also showed how ugly this kind of mission can get. Mines, missiles, confusion, and sudden escalation were never far away. That history matters because it kills the fantasy that keeping Hormuz open is easy. People hear the words "send the Navy" and imagine a clean solution. There is no clean solution. A narrow waterway can become a maze of mines, drones, fast boats, missiles, and fear. One successful strike can reshape the whole psychological picture. One burning tanker can do what 10 speeches cannot. So when Iran reclosed Hormuz, America faced a brutal strategic choice. Option 1 was to accept higher risk and push constant escorts through a corridor that could become a shooting gallery. Option 2 was to launch a much larger direct war to break Iran's capacity fast. Option 3 was to hit Iran in a place that changed the pressure equation without immediately relying on endless convoy heroics. And this is the move that changed everything. The United States moved to enforce a naval blockade against Iranian ports and coastal shipping. Read that again slowly. Instead of only reacting at the mouth of the choke point, Washington pushed the contest back onto Iran's own maritime access. That is a completely different kind of signal. It says if you try to hold the world's energy artery hostage, we can squeeze your coastline, your shipping, your trade routes, and your ability to move normally through your own waters. That is why the title of this story matters so much. Iran's rulers reclosed Hormuz. Then America did this. Not a symbolic protest, not just another warning. It answered pressure with counter-pressure. And according to reporting at the time, U.S. forces began enforcing that blockade by turning ships away from Iranian port access. In plain English, Washington was saying that the cost of maritime blackmail would not be distributed evenly across the world. Iran would feel it directly. This is the key strategic insight. America was not simply trying to reopen a route. It was trying to change incentives. That sounds technical, but it is actually very human. When someone keeps breaking the rules because everyone else pays the bill, the only way to stop the behavior is to move the bill back onto the rule breaker. That is what the blockade was designed to do. Now, was that a perfect solution? No. There is no perfect solution in a crisis like this. A blockade can escalate, it can create legal controversy, it can frighten commercial shippers, it can invite retaliation in other domains. But from a strategic point of view, it was not random. It was an attempt to reverse the leverage. Iran wanted the world asking, how much pain can a closure cause us? America wanted Iran asking, how much pain can this strategy cause us? Those are very different questions. And in geopolitics, the side that changes the question often changes the outcome. Now let's step back and look at why Hormuz matters so much in hard numbers. Because without the scale, the drama can sound abstract. Recent energy data shows that around 20 million barrels of oil per day moved through the Strait of Hormuz in 2024. That is roughly 1/5 of global petroleum liquids consumption. On top of that, about 1/5 of global liquefied natural gas trade also passed through the same corridor, much of it linked to Qatar. This is why even the rumor of disruption can move crude prices almost immediately. And here is another detail people often miss. Most of that energy is not going to the United States. Asian markets are especially exposed. China, India, Japan, and South Korea are among the biggest destinations for oil moving through the strait. So a Hormuz crisis is not just a U.S.-Iran problem. It is a pressure wave hitting the central nervous system of the world economy. That matters because it widens the audience. Suddenly, every major power has an interest. Some want stability, some want leverage, some want cheap energy, some want America distracted, some want to keep relations with both sides. But nobody serious can ignore the consequences. Now here is where the story becomes even more subtle. The United States itself is less dependent on Gulf oil than it was decades ago. American domestic production is much higher than in the past, and U.S. imports from Persian Gulf countries have fallen sharply over time. That gives Washington a certain strategic breathing room. It does not mean America is immune. Of course not. Global oil prices still affect the U.S. economy. But it does mean the pain is more indirect for America than for many Asian importers. That changes the balance. Iran may believe it can raise costs for the world, but America may believe it can endure the shock longer than Iran can endure a direct squeeze on its own trade. That is the kind of cold calculation that sits beneath the headlines. There is another layer too. Alternative routes exist, but they are limited. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have some pipeline capacity that can bypass the strait, but only part of the total volume can be rerouted. In other words, if Hormuz is seriously blocked, the pipes do not magically solve the problem. They soften the blow. They do not erase it. And this is why even partial disruption matters so much. Quick pause before we go deeper. If this breakdown is helping you see the chessboard behind the headlines, hit like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who thinks energy politics is boring. Nothing gets boring when the world's fuel line is on the table. A lot of viewers hear closure and imagine a giant gate slamming shut. Real life is messier than that. You do not need a perfect closure to create chaos. If ship owners fear attacks, if insurers spike premiums, if crews refuse routes, if ports delay schedules, if navies start escorting under threat, the economic effect begins long before traffic falls to zero. This is why strategic choke points are so powerful. They weaponize uncertainty. And that is exactly why America's response had to be about more than physically moving ships from point A to point B. It had to be about credibility. Because once the world starts to believe that a vital sea lane can be repeatedly disrupted with no real cost to the disruptor, then every future crisis becomes easier to trigger. Every militia, every proxy, every revisionist state learns the same lesson. Global commerce is fragile, and democracies will absorb pain before they impose it. Washington could not afford that lesson to stick. So the blockade was not only about Iran, it was a message to every observer watching from far beyond the Gulf. The message was simple. If you attack the plumbing of the global economy, the answer may not be limited to defense. It may come back as coercion against your own system. That message matters in a world where shipping lanes, data cables, chip supply chains, and energy routes are all becoming strategic terrain. Now, let me present the strongest counter-argument, because serious analysis has to do that. Some people will say America's move was dangerous overreach. They will argue that blockades can blur legal lines, push escalation, and make de-escalation harder. They will say a superpower should focus on protecting navigation, not broadening the conflict. And they are not crazy for saying that. There is truth in the warning. History is full of military actions that were designed to restore order and instead widen the battlefield. There is also the practical problem. A blockade sounds strong, but strength only matters if it is sustainable. Can it be maintained? Can it survive retaliation? Can it avoid dragging neutral shipping into larger conflict? Can it keep allies aligned? Can it hold up if markets panic anyway? Those are real questions. But here is the other side of the argument, and I think it is the harder one to dismiss. What is the alternative if a regime repeatedly tests closure as a tool of leverage? Do you escort forever? Do you absorb repeated price shocks forever? Do you let each new crisis become a negotiation over how much blackmail the world must tolerate? At some point, passivity becomes its own escalation. It teaches the wrong lesson, and that is why this moment feels bigger than one crisis. It is really about the rules of maritime order. For generations, the United States has treated freedom of navigation not as a nice slogan, but as a core interest. Not because every waterway belongs to America, but because the global system that supports trade, energy, and alliances depends on open transit. If that principle weakens in Hormuz, it does not stay in Hormuz. It echoes in the South China Sea. It echoes in the Red Sea. It echoes anywhere a narrow route can be turned into a political weapon. That is why America's response, however controversial, was about deterrence as much as logistics. Deterrence is not simply about destroying an enemy's forces. It is about reshaping what the enemy thinks will happen if he acts. And Iran's leadership has long relied on a belief that it can operate in the gray zone, creating pain without triggering a direct cost proportionate to that pain. The blockade challenged that belief. It said the gray zone is not cost-free. It said maritime coercion can produce maritime punishment. It said there is a threshold beyond which indirect pressure will be met with direct counter-pressure. That is a very important shift. But here is the most important point of all. America was not trying only to win a move. It was trying to win the story. That may sound soft, but it is not. In modern geopolitics, narrative shapes endurance. If Iran can frame itself as the patient resistor and America as the unstable escalator, it gains room. If America can frame itself as the defender of a global commons against economic hostage-taking, it gains room. Perception affects coalitions, markets, diplomacy, and time. And time matters because these contests are rarely decided in one dramatic day. They are decided over weeks and months as governments test each other's stamina. Iran's rulers understand stamina. They have spent decades building a system that survives isolation, pressure, sanctions, and confrontation. But survival is not the same as strategic success. A state can endure and still become weaker, poorer, more brittle, more feared, and more boxed in. That is the trap Iran faces. Every time it reaches for leverage through disruption, it proves that it can spoil. But it also reminds the world why so many countries hesitate to trust it. And this brings us to a deeper irony. Closing Hormuz can make Iran look powerful for a moment. But if the response convinces more countries that Iran must be contained more tightly, then the short-term image of strength may produce long-term strategic isolation. That is the danger of theatrical coercion. It can impress your supporters today while narrowing your options tomorrow. Now let's talk about what everyone should really watch next, because the most important part of a crisis is often what happens after the loudest moment. First, watch shipping behavior, not just government statements. If major commercial players still hesitate, reroute, delay, or demand heavy protection, that tells you the fear is real, even if politicians sound confident. Second, watch energy markets over time, not just in one spike. A brief jump in prices is dramatic, but persistent risk premiums tell you that traders believe the underlying problem is unresolved. Third, watch Asian diplomacy. Because so much of Hormuz traffic heads toward Asia, the responses of China, India, Japan, and South Korea matter enormously. They may not all speak in the same tone, but their choices reveal how much pressure they are willing to place on Iran and how much instability they are willing to tolerate. Fourth, watch whether America's policy remains narrow or expands. Is the goal simply to raise the price of closure? Is it to force negotiations? Is it to weaken Iran's capacity at sea? Or does it begin sliding toward a much larger confrontation? Clear goals matter. The wider the mission becomes, the harder it gets to keep support. Fifth, watch the insurance market. That sounds boring, but insurance is where fear becomes a number. When premiums jump, you are seeing crisis translated into cost. And sixth, watch the language inside Iran. Authoritarian regimes often reveal their stress indirectly. Listen for shifts from triumph to blame, from defiance to victimhood, from certainty to emotional overstatement. Political systems under strain often talk louder because they feel weaker. Now let's return to the core question. Did Iran reclosing Hormuz prove strength? In one narrow sense, yes. It proved Iran can still create disruption. It proved the regime still knows how to weaponize geography, ambiguity, and fear. It proved that even a country under pressure can threaten a route the world depends on. But in the bigger sense, the answer is more complicated. One small favor before we bring this home. If you want more videos that turn breaking news into clear strategy, share this video, join the channel, and press like. It tells the algorithm that serious viewers still exist. A move is only strong if it improves your position. And when America answered with a blockade of Iranian ports and shipping access, it turned the crisis from a one-sided threat into a contest over endurance, legitimacy, and economic pain. That is not where Tehran wanted the spotlight. Because it is one thing to threaten the world. It is another thing to discover the world's strongest navy is willing to make your own coastline part of the bill. This is the part many headlines miss. Power is not just the ability to cause trouble. Real power is the ability to decide who pays more for the trouble. Iran tried to tell the world, if we suffer, everyone suffers. America replied, then you will suffer first, faster, and more directly. That reply may not end the conflict. It may not solve the wider rivalry. It may not produce peace. But it changes the strategic conversation, and that is why this episode matters beyond the Gulf. Because every rival of the United States is studying the same lesson. They are asking, if we threaten a choke point, sabotage a route, or squeeze a critical artery of the global economy, how will Washington respond? With speeches? With escorts? With sanctions months later? Or with immediate counter-pressure that lands where it hurts? The answer shapes future behavior. That is why moments like this are never just local. They become case studies for the next crisis, and the next, and the next. There is also a moral dimension here that should not be ignored. When leaders play games with a choke point like Hormuz, they are not only challenging rival governments, they are gambling with ordinary people who will never hear their names, families paying more for fuel, workers facing higher transport costs, airlines cutting routes, factories delaying production, poor countries absorbing imported inflation. The map looks strategic from above. From below, it hits human lives. That is why the politics of disruption is so poisonous. It lets a small group of decision-makers export pain outward, hoping distance will hide responsibility. But responsibility does not disappear just because the suffering is indirect. And maybe that is the clearest way to understand why the American response was so sharp. It was not only about defending ships. It was about rejecting the idea that a regime can repeatedly externalize its crisis onto the rest of the world and expect everyone else to quietly manage the consequences. Now, will this produce a stable outcome? That depends on what comes next. If both sides look for a ladder down, the shock may create a new balance of caution. If either side mistakes pressure for a blank check, the confrontation can widen. If outside powers push hard for de-escalation, there may be room for controlled bargaining. If they hedge, stall, or exploit the chaos, the crisis can harden into a pattern. But whatever happens next, one thing is already clear. The reclosure of Hormuz was supposed to show the world that Iran could still seize the initiative. Instead, it may be remembered as the moment Iran discovered that initiative cuts both ways. Because once America decided not merely to absorb the pressure, not merely to escort around the pressure, but to redirect the pressure back at Iran's own maritime lifelines, the meaning of the confrontation changed. And that is the real story. Not simply that a strait was closed, not simply that oil markets got nervous, not simply that another Middle East crisis made headlines. The real story is that one side tried to weaponize the artery of the world economy, and the other side answered by touching the circulatory system of the attacker itself. That is why this feels bigger than a maritime dispute. It is a test of whether the age of coercive chokepoint politics will be tolerated, normalized, or punished. And history usually turns on questions like that long before the public notices. So the next time you hear the word Strait of Hormuz, do not picture a remote patch of water that only matters to oil traders and admirals. Picture a narrow corridor where geography becomes leverage, fear becomes price, and strategy becomes personal. Picture rulers trying to prove that disruption gives them control. Picture a superpower deciding that the answer to blackmail is not patience alone, but pressure in return. And then ask yourself the question that really matters. If this is how the world responds when one choke point is threatened, what happens in the next crisis when the stakes are even higher? Because that is when we will find out whether this was just one dramatic episode in a troubled region or the beginning of a much harder global rule. If you close the artery, expect your own lifelines to be squeezed. That is a dangerous rule. It is also, from Washington's point of view, the only rule that might stop the game from being played again. And that is why Iran's mullahs reclosed Hormuz. Then America did this, and the whole world had to pay attention.